Failed commando operation in Pokrovsk. Ukrainian special forces from the so-called GUR carried out a commando operation in Pokrovsk with the goal of re-establishing contact with Ukrainian troops trapped in the region. The spectacular operation, led by the head of Ukrainian intelligence himself, Kirilo Budanov, turned out to be a complete and total fiasco. The Russian armed forces reported the elimination of all members of the GUR commando unit. Russia appears to be in virtually full and total control of Pokrovsk, to the despair of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Del presidente ucraniano Volodymyr Zelensky. Comienza inminentemente.
Russia's advance toward the Dnieper in depth is about to begin. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 278 of Demolishing Myths Live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship. Demolishers, in this broadcast, we're going to focus on one of the most spectacular commando military operations of recent times, but also one of the most disastrous. Why?
Más desastrosas. ¿Por qué? Porque el día de ayer.
Because yesterday, following a post on Twitter, or rather on X, the former Twitter, by Oliver Carroll, a so-called journalist from the British outlet The Economist, although many simply describe him as a Ukrainian propagandist, the story began circulating around the world, the news of a Ukrainian commando operation in Pokrovsk. The original post said, "Update. It is rumored that Ukrainian military intelligence is carrying out a bold counteroffensive near Pokrovsk to reopen key logistical lines." Some videos shared with me supposedly show supply drops from helicopters in areas Russia claims to control. I have not been able to independently verify the videos.
No he podido verificar los videos de forma independiente. Naturalmente, esta publicación.
Naturally, this publication appeared to be coordinated with the Ukrainian armed forces, and in particular with the GUR special forces. As part of a commando operation, that made little sense. Or rather, I should correct myself, no sense at all from a military standpoint. To the point that different versions emerged with varying objectives or characterizations of this special operation. Carroll himself described it as a special operation aimed at carrying out a counteroffensive, no more and no less, even though only 15 soldiers were involved.
Aunque participaban 15 soldados, en ese caso representaría la contraofensiva.
In that case, it would represent the counteroffensive with the smallest number of military personnel in the history of war, in all of human history. But beyond that, other versions began to appear. For example, the news of a commando rescue operation aimed at creating a channel of aid and evacuation for the Ukrainian troops trapped in the region. Even more versions spread around. In addition to the counteroffensive, the rescue, an operation intended to capture some high-ranking Russian officer. In short, multiple versions of something that, once again, made no apparent military sense.
Sin sentido aparente desde lo militar. Carroll acompañaba esta publicación.
Carroll accompanied this publication, once again, surely coordinated with the Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, knowing this journalist, Carroll, a mere propagandist for Ukraine in the British media, where else? The Economist. Carroll accompanied the images with this video. Here indeed, some surprising elements appear. While in the original video, they paused to count the members of this special operation, the members of this commando group. 15 of them descended from the helicopters. There in plain sight, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And after a while, the remaining ones become visible, perhaps a few more.
Otros faltantes, por ahí algunos más. Un video muy cortito hacia adelante, el resto, ahí la salida.
A very short video, slightly ahead of the rest, showed the departure of one of the helicopters, which, by the way, added a new twist to the madness of this film. The operation up to that point had taken place in Pokrovsk, generally speaking, in Pokrovsk, and according to this journalist, in areas supposedly controlled by the Russians. In addition to the craziness of this operation and the 15 soldiers confirmed in this video, 2 US Black Hawk UH-60 helicopters suddenly appeared. One of the most famous and celebrated war helicopters, not only for its participation in multiple situations, scenarios and conflicts, but also for its appearance in countless movies. If I remember correctly, even a Hollywood film titled none other than Black Hawk. And supposedly, the United States had made donations of all kinds of weapons, but not of these helicopters, which meant that US helicopters appeared unexpectedly as evidence of the enormous quantity of weapons sent without even publishing the records, in addition to the billions of dollars in armaments officially delivered.
Dólares en armas enviados oficialmente. Así que armas oficiales y armas extra.
So, official weapons and extraordinary weapons. 15 soldiers then, and the publication of an operation in Pokrovsk. Well, immediately, pro-Russian public intelligence experts, either directly Russian or generally pro-Russian, began analyzing these images to determine the actual location where these soldiers landed, and whether they indeed descended into territory supposedly controlled by Russia. Something crucial amid the back and forth, the claims and counterclaims regarding Pokrovsk. Because even to this day, remember that according to Russian media, Pokrovsk and Kupiansk appear to be practically under Russian control, showing a situation of encirclement, while Ukrainian media, and above all, Ukrainian authorities, reject this as a mere lie. They describe the situation as complex, but without major Russian advances and without any kind of encirclement. In recent hours, even Western media have begun to validate the perspective of Russian outlets, to confirm the reports from Russian media, obvious to everyone of course, about an encirclement both in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk. Even Putin himself, remember we mentioned it here, had made an offer after these encirclements had trapped 5,500 soldiers in Pokrovsk and another 5,000 in Kupiansk. And since Putin did not want a massacre like the one in Mariupol, more specifically in the Azovstal steel plant, when, remember, the Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded, and despite the offer of surrender and the promise that their lives would be spared by the Russian armed forces, the Ukrainian political and military authorities rejected it, which led to the massacre of a large number of those Ukrainian soldiers. In Azovstal, since Putin didn't want that, and, faced with the imminent capture, destruction, and elimination of the Ukrainian soldiers, he offered a ceasefire, allowing journalists from around the world, including from Western media, to enter and document the situation, then leave the area so that the Ukrainian soldiers could surrender with a guarantee that their lives would be respected. Well, Zelensky not only rejected this, but also called it a lie. He not only rejected the offer, but directly denied the existence of an encirclement. So, in this whole context of versions and counter-versions, statements and contradictions, affirmations and counter-affirmations, so crucial for Zelensky's political survival, since the fall of Pokrovsk would deal a severe blow to his continuity. Remember that in Zelensky's case, political survival goes hand in hand with literal survival, with his own life. In both matters, his hold on power and his life seem interconnected. Hence, in part, the obsession, the relentless pursuit of excellence in sustaining the war. His very life seems to be at stake. Russian intelligence experts then began analyzing the images and confirmed that the Ukrainian GUR soldiers had indeed landed in the area, but not inside Pokrovsk, as the Ukrainians claimed, and as the original version stated, but rather on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, in a zone not yet under their control. Here we show it on the map, updated as of today. This is the landing area, right here, where the blue icons mark the landing site, just outside the Pokrovsk and Minograd pocket. Remember that Pokrovsk, or rather, that's what they call it, refers to the urban agglomeration formed by two cities, one being Pokrovsk proper, located here on the left and almost completely taken, and the other on the right called Minograd, which is besieging Pokrovsk on the verge of its final fall. In the meantime, the Russians had managed, remember, we also showed this here, to capture Rodinsky. They had also made a very significant advance in this area, which created an encirclement, leaving only one possible escape route through a field, under skies crowded with drones. So no one could leave this place without certain death, or at least without the vast majority of soldiers who tried to escape through that narrow passage under a sky full of drones, facing a fate of certain death. That's the situation. After the confirmation, by the way, of the landing site of these soldiers, the news appeared for the first time in a Western outlet, in one of the major media organizations, beyond that initial version from The Economist journalist, but published on his personal X account, not in The Economist. Thus, yesterday this column appeared in Reuters, even with an image referring, logically, to the original post on Twitter. Here, then, is the confirmation by the media of what happened. Ukraine deploys special forces in besieged Pokrovsk, sources say. Operation supervised by the head of military intelligence, according to a source. This is the Reuters report, and shortly afterward, as we go over the events chronologically. First, the post on X, then, the response from pro-Russian intelligence experts, who claimed they hadn't landed in Pokrovsk, but on the outskirts. Third, this publication in a European outlet, confirming the first version. And shortly after that, suddenly, this image spread across social media. None other than Mr. Budanov.
El señor Budanov, Kirillov Budanov.
Kirill Budanov appeared in a photograph circulated as a general image of several Ukrainian soldiers, but someone, using a monitor with obviously very high resolution, zoomed in on the image and determined that indeed here, dressed in black, very close by in Pavlohrad, appeared none other than, 24 hours earlier, the head of Ukrainian intelligence services, with the clear objective of leading this commando operation. Thus, the cream of the crop, the very best of the Ukrainian armed forces. On one hand, their famous intelligence director, Budanov, in command, previously secret American Black Hawk helicopters, and members of the elite special forces, members of the GUR, took part in this operation. Shortly afterward, there were also confirmations in Russian media and on Russian Telegram channels of the actual sighting of the Black Hawk helicopters in the area, beyond that first video released by the Ukrainians. With the images thus confirmed, the possibility of a purely media operation staged with artificial intelligence, a simple video fabrication, essentially disappeared. No, that possibility vanished because Russian media themselves were now documenting the arrival of these helicopters in the area. The images were shared by a pro-Russian Telegram channel, which mainly drew attention to the perspective of the footage, taken from a road, right at ground level, a position now typical of Russian drones stationed along roads, waiting for Ukrainian military vehicles to pass in order to begin their attacks. And this drone, waiting there, transmitting an image, happened to show, attention, down below, to the right, in the middle right area, the passage of that quick image of the first Black Hawk. And now, through the middle, the second Black Hawk in the area. UH-60, the code for the Black Hawk helicopter passing through there. And shortly after, not only that, but even better confirmation. Here, a video clearly taken by some soldier in the area, with a mobile phone, a cell phone, showing the Black Hawks flying very close to the ground, flying very low. Lower than that, impossible. They would already be descending to the height of the treetops, with the logical goal of, in this way, not appearing on Russian radars, nor being exposed, incidentally, to the systems known as SAMs. Well, the portable anti-air defense systems, basically a shoulder-fired rocket launcher capable of taking down a helicopter without the slightest problem. At such a low altitude, this creates far fewer chances of being hit due to the quick pass overhead of any soldier carrying one of these missile launchers.
This
was the confirmation, and once again the hypotheses, leaks, and versions about the fate of these soldiers began to circulate. Even in the most fervently pro-Ukrainian Telegram channels, news started spreading about the opening of a communication channel with the encircled soldiers. Something strange, because Zelensky himself denied that such an encirclement existed. But anyway, despite that, the pro-Ukrainian channels presented the opening of a communication channel with effectively encircled soldiers as an achievement, which meant that Zelensky's denial was clearly a plain and simple lie. But well, in this context, unconfirmed images also began to appear, supposedly taken by the Ukrainian soldiers themselves, who had descended from those helicopters.
Descendidos de estos helicópteros. Aquí una de ellas, otra vez en...
Here's one of them, once again on a pro-Ukrainian outlet, with these images. Pay attention. This one here. Now yes, this one's supposedly not confirmed. Oh, how nice. As always, right? On one side the Ukrainian patch, and here the patch of the Ukrainian nationalists, right? Naturally, these elite Ukrainian troops with sympathies for Ukrainian nationalism, spelled with a Z. Right, these are the colors of the flag of the Ukrainian nationalist forces, which took part alongside the SS in World War II, carrying out massacres of civilians in support of the Nazi occupation of Ukraine and against the Soviet Union.
La Unión Soviética. Sí, muchos ucranianos, por cierto, también participaron en el Ejército Rojo con...
Many Ukrainians, by the way, also served in the Red Army, fighting the Nazis. Let's not be unfair either. Ukrainians were on both sides. But these men, elite troops, show, by the way, this tendency toward the Ukrainian ultranationalist Nazis. Well, here, sorry for the distraction, I was getting a phone call. Here, the unconfirmed arrival of these supposed elite troops to the combat zone. It seems so, right? Yes, the image does there, the arrival of a drone.
Ahí la llegada de un dron. Todavía
still standing.
más ruido de drones.
More drone noise. The tremendous sound in these images, that of the quadcopter propellers.
Helicópteros. Otro más, uno tras...
Another one after another. This once again spread by the Ukrainians themselves. Attention.
Atención. Ya los techos crujiendo al borde de el...
The roofs creaking on the verge of collapse. These are the images released by them as proof of the success of this mission. The ones we're about to show now were released by pro-Russian channels, documenting the fate of these people. Not only this small group, but the rest of those 15 soldiers. The miraculous mission, so as not to call it suicidal, of launching a counteroffensive with 15 soldiers in a passageway packed with drones, and of course, controlled by the Russian armed forces. Well, these are the images released by the Ukrainian channels.
Una vez más, esto generaba euforia en muchos de...
Once again, this generated euphoria among many followers of these channels. But soon after, news suddenly appeared about the alleged elimination of these soldiers. At first, they were simply posts on Telegram and Twitter, without evidence, texts claiming confirmation of the soldiers' deaths. The Ukrainians denied this in the ongoing information war, which is so crucial in the context of a war, and in a situation like this one, the encirclement of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian political and military authorities directly denied the existence of such an encirclement, something essential for the morale, of the troops.
La situación anímica, ¿sí? De las tropas, bueno, por eso el ida y vuelta permanente y por eso.
Well, that's why there's this constant back and forth, and that's why we're going over this chronologically, with all the twists and turns, the questions and answers, the statements and contradictions throughout this whole situation, until suddenly, finally, the pro-Russian channels started showing these images. On one hand at first, a small fragment of the original video, and from there, additional footage with music, like this one or this one here. Images from drones documenting the elimination of each and every member of this commando group. Some drones even went inside the houses. Maybe this is the house seen in the previous video.
Quizás esta la casa a la vista en el video anterior, todos y cada uno de.
Each and every one of these soldiers was eliminated. Initially, the pro-Ukrainian information sphere rejected this version, until the Telegram channel Deep State itself, a quintessentially pro-Ukrainian channel, even today under the control of the Ukrainian government, finally stated, in a post on that channel, that they had unfortunately confirmed that all the images compiled in this video and later circulated as separate clips did indeed correspond to the area surrounding the landing of these soldiers, these special operations members. Thus, in a subtle way, they were effectively confirming the loss of all of them.
De la baja de todos ellos. Los 15 soldados descendidos en esta.
The 15 soldiers who descended in this operation were hit by Russian drones, the same ones that were monitoring the possible withdrawal of the Ukrainian soldiers. Here, they didn't even need to make a 180-degree turn, since their cameras provided a panoramic view. They simply attacked the soldiers coming from the rear of this plane, in the Pokrovsk pocket. Meanwhile, Zelensky once again denied everything that had happened.
Una vez más todo lo sucedido. Aquí, por cierto.
Here, by the way, the Ukrainian president with an expired mandate at a press conference just yesterday, truly bewildering, because of the number of not just lies, because ultimately in the propaganda war, in any war, information once again becomes a battlefield, now accompanied by the top military commanders, even the foreign minister, also sitting next to him. There he was, well, with his little glasses. Oh, that boy's face, my goodness. Well, not only did he present a bunch of false claims once again, which, to be fair, can't be blamed on Zelensky in this case, but in this matter of denying the encirclement, that falls within the framework of the propaganda war, right? Now, on top of that, he presented some points truly detached from reality, completely senseless, among them in response to questions from that journalist.
En respuesta a las preguntas de esta periodista, aquí, por aquí la versión.
Here is the transcribed and translated version of this. We're simply presenting a fragment related to Pokrovsk from this long conference. At some point, a little later on, if I remember correctly, this is the moment of the question. Well, it doesn't seem so. Apparently, right at that moment, a second earlier, you can hear the journalist's voice asking precisely about Pokrovsk. The following. I understand that the issue of sanctions is important. That's how Zelensky had begun his conference, by the way. I understand that the issue of sanctions is important, but what about Pokrovsk today? What is the situation there now? Because a lot of Russian information is false. That is the journalist's question, just shown in the footage.
Esa es la pregunta de la periodista recién mostrada en las imágenes y va a responder Zelensky lo siguiente.
And Zelensky is going to respond as follows. I ask you not to believe what Russia says. I was in some offices, even physically, and I saw different maps. I saw a map of the fighting on Ukrainian territory that looks, let's say, strange. And I also saw other maps. That is, for some reason we have different maps of the actual fighting in Ukraine. It's understandable that Russian maps are different, but, in Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the United States, the maps differ. And at some point we coordinate all this. We understand where there are certain problems and where there are certain manipulations. He already started with a somewhat cryptic answer. This, by the way, is the foreign minister, Antonio, but responding to Zelensky's statement, that is. That's why the situation in Pokrovsk is complicated. I've said this here once again. You see, all their strength. You know that in this direction, there are 170,000 enemy soldiers. That's a lot. Really a lot. The next morning I spoke with Commander-in-Chief Zelensky. There are no changes in Pokrovsk. There are Russians in Pokrovsk. Our troops are destroying them little by little. Therefore, we must understand that there is a very serious battle for Pokrovsk. Their mission was to take Pokrovsk. To take our Pokrovsk, especially this city. Here is the report from one of the senior military commanders. Their mission was to take Pokrovsk, to take our Pokrovsk, specifically this city, because they failed to take Sumy, because they failed to take Kupiansk. Kupiansk, by the way, is also encircled. Anyway, they realize they're going to lose Kupiansk. That's all. The cleanup is underway. It's not easy, but it's already decided. Our forces will reach the river and block them. They can't even get through individually anymore because it's too difficult. So it's clear they're losing this. They've already lost it, yes. Dobropilya is completely cleared. Zaporizhia is also cleared. That's false, even on pro-Ukrainian maps. But anyway, they'll fight for them and hype it up as much as possible. Putin says, and here's the most delusional part of all, Putin says he's going to Pokrovsk. We'll gladly wait for him there. Everyone will applaud. We know how this will end. With a sort of, here comes the Russian journalist's moment.
Aquí el momento de la periodista rusa. Bueno, estaba queriendo esto hace un ratito, y aquí la respuesta ahí con la manito de Zelensky.
Well, I'd been wanting this for a little while, and here's the answer. There, with Zelensky's little hand. Sorry, I don't know Ukrainian, so I'm just presenting the video and reading through the passage of the full transcript. Sometimes I can't determine exactly where that part appears, but the literal transcript was released by the Ukrainians themselves. This is the moment there, with those faces of explanation. And this final delusion of Putin will go for Krupsk. Something never announced by Putin, not even close, wouldn't make sense anyway. Putin on the battlefield? What's the point? A delusion. Putin and Lavrov will applaud it, but we'll be waiting there. We know how this will end, like a kind of veiled threat. We're going to bring about Putin's elimination. Well, in another part of this long press conference, by the way, Zelensky himself, together with that high command, that Ukrainian officer, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, also made a truly absurd statement about the alleged destruction of Oryeshnik missiles by the Ukrainian armed forces at a launch site last year. According to Zelensky, last year, while the Russians were testing the Oryeshnik missiles, before the first Oryeshnik missile attack against Ukraine, they carried out an operation at that time. A Ukrainian Commando unit supposedly managed to destroy one of the 3 Oryeshnik missiles that had been built. He did not present any kind of evidence about how they were able to cause the destruction of that missile before it was known globally, before the official global presentation of this missile.
Presentación oficial de este misil a escala global. Recuerden que en las 6.
Remember that among the 6 superweapons announced by Putin in 2018, the Oryeshnik was not included. And they only recently introduced the Oryeshnik as a 7th superweapon with Russia's attack in Pavlograd, if I remember correctly, against an industrial plant. After Operation Spiderweb, I'm recalling all this from memory now, so that's why I'm uncertain. After that operation against the Russian strategic triad, those drone attacks on Russian strategic bombers that made no military sense whatsoever, but served as a provocation, Russia then responded with an attack using this previously unknown missile.
hasta entonces desconocido. Esa es la secuencia, si no recuerdo mal, puede que cometa un error.
That's the sequence,
de memoria, pero bueno.
if I remember correctly, though I might be misremembering. But anyway, until then, that missile was considered something unknown. And according to Zelensky, they had destroyed at least one of the first 3 missiles at a testing site, before it became publicly known, before its presentation, before its introduction to the world through an attack. Even the intelligence services weren't aware of it. And supposedly, the Ukrainian forces had already destroyed one of these missiles. Why didn't they present it publicly at the time? Well, Zelensky didn't answer that, and no journalist asked that question either.
Realizó esa pregunta, con lo cual ya, primero la mentira sobre Pokrovsk, de que
So then, first the lie about Pokrovsk, that in Pokrovsk there's no problem, the situation is spectacular, all the Russians are under control, we're crushing lots of Russians. Well, a typical propaganda lie, tolerable up to that point. But then this thing about Putin will go to Pokrovsk and we'll kill him there, and then this other thing about we destroyed Oryeshnik missiles a year ago at a testing site. All of it really very, very strange. Maybe it's the situation, this man's desperation, or perhaps the use of some white-colored substance that causes euphoria in the human body, like coffee. Well, not like coffee.
Como el café, pero bueno, no como el café. Aunque muchos de estos polvos blancos provienen.
Although many of these white powders, also coming from coffee-producing areas, produce, for those who know, few words are needed. That might be what's causing these kinds of delirious statements. But the Ukrainian authorities aren't even responding with anything that makes sense anymore. And I had presented this before, by the way, before the appearance of the videos showing the elimination of those soldiers, but when the reports and announcements that this Commando operation had begun were already spreading. So, the Commando operation itself, already underway, somehow clashed with the version that everything was fine in Pokrovsk. So then, why would you start a Commando operation if in Pokrovsk the Ukrainians seem to be doing great? No problem, just killing Russians, that's all.
De primera, ningún problema, matando rusos, nada más. Otra contradicción, todo.
Another contradiction. All of this is quite rushed, disconnected, in a field where until not long ago the Ukrainians, with the help of the CIA and MI6, the field of communication, used to present a very, very polished line. Information or disinformation campaigns, versions, counterversions, all very well managed for the general public. Naturally, not for those who follow critical analyses like those on this channel, but for the general public. They presented a neat little package in the media, very tidy. Putin on the verge of death, Russia almost defeated, Russian washing machines. Well, all those stupidities looked very convincing to the general audience. Nowadays, even their own versions and counter-versions no longer make any sense. Even Western media themselves began to pick up the Russian versions. And also, another contradiction, pay attention to this, the spokesperson for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that chubby guy sitting there with white hair, was presenting this on his Telegram in Ukrainian, translated into English. The following I now translate into Spanish. Frankly, I wouldn't recommend any reporter to trust Putin's proposal for a corridor to the war zone. I saw these proposals in the past. In 2014, in Ilovaisk. Apparently, in that case, there was a similar situation. Putin's only objective, this man is responding once again to Putin's proposal, was to allow journalists to enter under a ceasefire, document the situation, have the journalists leave, and then have the soldiers surrender to avoid a massacre. Obviously, well, they rejected this. And here is the specific statement from the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs rejecting it. But at the same time, this rejection of Putin's proposal implies an acknowledgement of the existence of a pocket and an encirclement with Ukrainian soldiers.
Y de un embolsamiento con soldados ucranianos. Por un lado, entonces, Zelensky, no.
On the one hand, then, Zelensky says, no, the encirclement represents a claim of Russian propaganda, a lie typical of the Kremlin's disinformation campaigns. But then a spokesperson from the ministry responds, "No, we don't want a ceasefire in the Pokrovsk pocket." So they end up contradicting each other. Well, once again, a lot of confusion, a lot of disorganization, something different from the past. And this man wraps it up with a threat, even toward journalists. Attention, Putin's goal, Putin's only goal, is to prolong the war, and he has never honored these ceasefire proposals. Don't help him by justifying his crimes through Russian provocations against journalists. By the way, I remind all media outlets that any visit to the territories occupied by Russia without Ukraine's permission is a violation of both national legislation and international law. It will have long-term reputational and legal consequences. We are watching them closely. There is even a threat to journalists, in case anyone had wanted to take part in this proposal for a ceasefire from Putin and for surrender without the removal of all these soldiers. Well, he explicitly rejects it here, with yet another threat to journalists, but at the same time, in doing so, he rejects Zelensky's claim that there is no encirclement in Pokrovsk and that everything is fine. What else can we present regarding this?
¿Qué más podemos presentar respecto a esto? Bien, aquí finalmente un ejemplo.
Well, here's finally an example of a post from just a few hours ago, because even Western media are now beginning to pick up the version from Russian outlets, verified and re-verified with images already confirmed by Ukrainian Telegram channels themselves. Here, for example, a post from The Spectator, also anti-Russian, with no suspicion whatsoever of any sympathy for Putin, decidedly anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. This is the column published just minutes ago by Svetlana Morinets, who points out the situation of Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk, basically acknowledging the situation. What matters more, the land or the lives of the soldiers? That's the introduction, the first sentence of this Western outlet, which basically confirms the encirclement of Pokrovsk and, in a way, its imminent capture.
De alguna manera, su inminente captura. Presentemos muy rápido porque voy a participar ahora en un programa.
Let's move quickly, because I'm about to take part in a TV program in the studio, so I'll have to leave a bit earlier than usual. Let's then show the map with the current situation. Remember that this mapper shows in red the territories confirmed with visual images, while in grey are those already taken but not yet confirmed. Well, the latest Russian advance appears here. Pay attention to Pokrovsk, completely taken, by the way. Here, once again, what was said about this corridor, with Russian drones buzzing everywhere. And over here, by the way, the beginning of the offensives toward the interior of Minograd. Here, and in this area. The latest released image is this one here, showing Russian soldiers taking the Dina plant.
Tomando la planta de Dina, es el nombre de esta planta industrial.
It's the name of this industrial plant out there. Russian soldiers entering this place. It was quite difficult with such a backpack, but they still managed. It's located here, in this area. This is the situation in Pokrovsk. Basically, these soldiers are completely surrounded. Well, here, if I remember correctly, is the image of the Black Hawk shown earlier, captured here. And, by the way, the image of Budanov also captured. This will help us. It was shown before, that in this area, here, that in Pavlorada, Budanov in this cafe, well, the image isn't visible there, unfortunately. In this cafe, at a gas station, found by chance, through these images in this area, apparently to command the operation from closer. A totally and completely failed operation.
Operación total y completamente fallida. Repaso rápido ahora por esta zona. Aquí, por cierto,
quick overview of this area now. Here, by the way, more Russian advances, not only in Kupiansk. Kupiansk also has a huge pocket here inside, between these 2 points. But in addition to the Russian advances to the south, with the entire part of Kupiansk already taken, in the western area of the city, they began a spearhead advance toward here, in order to create 2 pockets, one on this side and another on the other. Also remember that in this area there's a river, the Oskol River, which on top of that has the shape of a delta, a swamp of wetlands.
Con lo cual, una vez destruidos todos estos puentes...
As a result, once all these bridges have been destroyed, and indeed they now appear completely destroyed, it will be very difficult for the soldiers, let alone armored vehicles or any form of transport, to leave this pocket. Not only because of the constant drone surveillance, but also because of the presence of this river. Even the soldiers themselves cannot cross it, since here we see this delta. Not just one, but many streams, swampy areas, wetlands. Therefore, it's nearly impossible for them to move through this without the bridges. The soldiers trapped here appear to be definitively trapped. That said, dear demolishers, and already too late, I must quickly end this broadcast to take part in another one from a studio in the city center.
Una transmisión desde un estudio en el centro de la ciudad. Nosotros todavía por Buenos Aires, recién la semana próxima de vuelta hacia...
We're still in Buenos Aires, heading back to Berlin only next week. That said, dear demolishers, we're going to wrap up this broadcast quickly here. Tomorrow, we'll start again with our talks with Fernando Moragon as host every Sunday. Today, Juan Antonio isn't with us because he still seems to be traveling somewhere in the world. But next week, we'll resume our talks with him on Friday, and he'll also be starting his own show on DMP Geopolitics. Please remember to help us out with a thumbs up, comments, sharing, and so on. All interactions with the platform help us spread critical geopolitical analysis. Demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Hasta el día de mañana. Chaucito. Okay.